The Tri-5 Nationals presented by CPP is the ultimate gathering of 55, 56, and 57 Chevrolets. And I'm bringing you coverage of all the cool vintage race cars, the historic cars on the property, and just some of the stuff that I thought was cool. And if you want more coverage of this event, my buddy Throttle Power, go to his channel. Everything is covered on his videos through hours of footage. For my coverage, I'm always looking for historic cars or cars that have a cool story or cars that have cool parts and pieces on them. That kind of stuff is what really gets me excited, so that's what I'm going to dive into today. I started off my week by photographing this 55 Chevrolet Super Stalker for a magazine feature, and you'll notice that it's got a ton of drag racing decals on it. It's not the most polished car in the world, but this thing has a lot of history. And the coolest thing to me is that Rene Garza bought this car when he was a freshman in high school, and he bought it for 150 bucks, and that was in 1968. He drove this thing on the street for a while and eventually turned it into a drag car in the 1970s. And this car, because of its super stock rules package, it is very specific on the engine combination. So this thing actually has a 265 cubic inch combination. The really crazy part about this car's combination is the drivetrain. So this thing has your standard Powerglide 2-speed automatic transmission, but it's running a 7,000 RPM stall speed converter with 683 gears out back. So this thing is absolutely screaming, doing everything it can do through the quarter mile. I was able to dig up a few old pictures of this car, and it used to be blue, and it's changed personalities through the years and now has this red and white paint job that's been on there since the 90s. And this thing has won a ton of races. Renee has raced all over the country, taking home victories from the U.S. Nationals, from the Gator Nationals. Basically, anywhere east of the Mississippi, this car has made passes in super stock trim. You'll notice on the inside, this car has a full interior. Again, super stock rules designate these types of things. So it's got a full Del Rey interior. It's got an old school 3-point roll bar that they've added a door bar to. Because this car runs in the mid-11s in the quarter mile, it's not required to have a more extensive roll cage than this. While we're on the subject of Superstock, let's take a look at another historic Superstocker, another O automatic car. You can see the Scotty's Speed and Custom lettering on there, Bowling Green, Kentucky, and the name Steve Hinton lettered on the door, and a ton of decals. This is back in the day when all those decals really mattered on the national circuit. Those were contingency decals that paid you extra money on top of your winnings for representing those brands. So these old cars, like from the 70s and 80s and even the 90s, they're littered with sponsor decals because they got a little extra money whenever they were in the winner's circle. Here's another Superstock car. This one's a 150 two-door sedan, and you can see they're a little more strategic in their decal layout here. And you can also see this car's got a pretty fresh paint job on it. The reality with this car is that it is an old car, but they've put it back together with some fairly modern parts, and they come out here to the Tri-5 Nationals to race against all the other cars, whether it's Superstock or other cars in the drag racing ranks. They don't really have those different class breakouts like they do in the NHRA. It's a little more casual and laid back, but there's still some really great class cars that show up for the event. When it comes to class cars, it doesn't get much better than this. This is Larry Nelson's 55 Chevrolet 150, and you can see, again, we're looking at a P stock designation on that quarter window. And this car was the starting point for Larry Nelson's career, not only in drag racing, but also his career at Jegs, as he worked there for decades and only recently retired from there. So this car is a beautiful representation of what he ran in 1972. And he won in Englishtown, New Jersey with this car. This isn't a recreation. This is a restoration of his actual 55 Chevrolet. So you'll see it's got a slick paint job with some cool hand lettering, and even the roof of this thing has a cool cobweb effect, which was very common in the 60s and 70s. And on the inside, it's very plain and simple. You'll see that bench seat has been notched out for the inline shifter. You'll also see a radio delete panel, a couple of auxiliary gauges, a metal flake steering wheel. Once again, this car is running a 265 cubic inch combination. You'll see that Hoarder carburetor on top. That's just like what would have come on this car. And they were allowed to make a few upgrades and changes to be NHRA legal. You'll see it's got a billet distributor and some fender well headers and things like that. But as far as the engine itself, they had some really serious rules to follow. And Larry had a lot of information as far as how he got to this combination and how successful it was back in the day, even though he only ran this car in this configuration for 1 year before stepping into a 55 station wagon and later building a Chevy 2 and many other drag cars throughout his career. But this is the one that started it all. The Tri-5 Nationals always brings out a great field of cars to compete in the junior stock eliminator. Now originally, back in the 60s, this junior stock category was basically anything lower than super stock. So any of your B stock or C stock or L stock or any of those cars would be considered a junior stock. So the Tri-5s really fell into that category because these were often pretty heavy cars with small cubic inches. So a lot of times they might fall into the O category, sometimes the P category, just depending on the engine combination. But you'll see a lot of historic cars in this group that are battling it out on the quarter mile just like they did back in the 60s. As part of the junior stock display area, I noticed a couple of really cool front engine dragsters. Now both of these belong to Dave Huber and both of them have cool histories. This first one we're looking at is a Chassis Research K88, and this is from the late 50s. It was purchased in 1959 from Clary's Custom Motive, and it was raced in 1960 by Tom Seibert. You'll notice it's got a small block Chevy engine, a blower and injection setup. This thing is about as traditional as you can get. It's even got early style cylinder heads on it. It's an early style setup. After this car was run for a few seasons, it was put away in storage for over 30 years. Then it was restored in 1999 by Dwight Hall, Porter Schrader, and the help of a lot of different friends, and now it's under the care of Dave Huber. Another front engine dragster on display is a Dragmaster chassis, and this one has some significant history as it was one of Mickey Thompson's cars back in the early 60s. Now, Mickey Thompson experimented with lots of different engine combinations, and at one time he experimented with a 4-cylinder engine combination from Pontiac. And it ran in this very dragster chassis in 1960 and 1961. And because the pace of drag racing was so quick back then, and things were changing and innovation was happening, Mickey Thompson ended up selling the car and ended up in Louisville, Kentucky of all places. So the car went through several different owners through the years, and ultimately it ended up in Dave Huber's hands in the 1980s. And he tore this thing all the way down and completely rebuilt it, put together this really cool engine combination. Of course, it's a small block Chevy. It's got a blower with a magnesium case. It's got a 2-port Hilburn fuel injection setup, and it's got tons of vintage speed parts all around. Now here's a really cool setup also on display with the junior stockers. This is a 57 Corvette, and you look under the hood, it's got a pretty stout small block, 2.4s. But the real interesting piece is when you look further back here. This car's actually got a trailer hitch on it, and it's got a custom single axle trailer with a front engine dragster mounted to it. So this is the ultimate combination, and believe it or not, these Corvettes and Tri-5s were actually used as tow vehicles quite often back in the day. And look at the combination on the front of this thing. It's got some really cool valve covers. Those are fin aluminum, but they've got risers to get them up high enough to clear roller rockers. And there's tons of great machined pieces on this thing. The engine mounts, lots and lots of great plumbing. Everything on this car is very sanitary. It's very clean. It almost looks like it's not even functional, but this car is functional. It's been raced here at Bowling Green in the past. So it's a great piece, and it looks so cool behind that Corvette. One of the most impressive cars out of the 2,600 plus cars in attendance was this 57 Corvette. And this is essentially a factory-built race car. Only 43 of these cars were built in 1957. And the list of options is pretty wild. So it all starts with that fuel-injected 283, but the real rare options come with the big brakes that are on this car, as well as the airbox. Now this airbox kind of looks crude, you know, it doesn't look fully finished like what you'd see on a show car like this, but this is how they were made. They were all handmade. All 43 airboxes were handmade, and they looked like this. And this car has such an incredible history, and it's so well documented that I'm planning on doing a full video to show you this car's full history. but I wanted to show it to you here. It was a very impressive piece, and it earned a top 25 award at the show out of those 2,600 cars. And it's just one of those things. It's a super clean restoration, but it's really the history that draws me closer to cars like this. Speaking of history, check out this 55 Chevrolet convertible. Now, it's really unusual to see a convertible in this gasser situation like this, but this car has some great history. Now, this car belongs to Todd Snick, and it was his father's car. This was Ron Snick's creation. It was a 55 convertible that he turned into a race car through the years. Now, this car has significant history in the Snick family, and now Todd has kind of reconfigured this thing so that he can get out and drive it and use it and tell its story. So I'm looking forward to being able to tell this car's story in a future video. But for now, we're just kind of looking at the highlights here. This car's got some great paint on it. The lettering is all original. It's got some pie crust slicks on the back, the 5-spoke wheels. The stance of the car, you know, it's not way up in the air. It's got a lot of great stuff, even though Todd admits that some of the modifications that his dad did were a little bit crude, like the roll bar or the rear suspension. It's still a really great piece of his family's history and a great piece of drag racing history. You can't have the Tri-5 Nationals without at least a few two-lane blacktop cars and American Graffiti cars. And this one's a great example. You'll see he's got the slick in the back, he's got the street tires on the car, which is how the car spent most of its time in the movie. And while the actual two-lane blacktop car was on the premises, I've already featured that in a previous video, and I wanted to be able to show off this pretty faithful recreation. I absolutely love this style of car right here. This is what I would consider a 60s or even a 70s hot rod. You'll see it has the front bumper taken off, the rear wheel wells have been radiused, it's got a Pontiac scoop on the hood. You know, this car looks shiny and it's ready for the street, but it could also do some damage at the drag strip. It's got fender well headers, it's got a 3-point Lakewood roll bar in it, some cool little bucket seats, and lots of good speed parts inside and out. So cars like this are really a staple for the Tri-5 Nationals because you'll see a lot of shiny show cars, but these cars like this really have personality. Next up, we got a really neat car that goes back into the NASCAR days of the 1950s, and this is when Chevrolet wanted to get involved with a factory-backed program, although these cars were not built by Chevrolet. Chevrolet delivered these cars, about 6 of them in total, to a company called Sedco based out of Atlanta, Georgia, and these cars were specially prepared for NASCAR racing. So they came from the factory as a 150 two-door sedan, no back seat, no frills, no accessories whatsoever, no radio, none of that. But these cars did have Chevrolet's 283 with factory fuel injection. So these cars went to Sedco and got prepared for NASCAR racing with special suspension. And you'll notice it's actually got 6-lug wheels. That was a trademark of the Black Widow cars. And this was a very short-lived program, only a few months between the start of building these very special cars and the end of Chevrolet's involvement in factory-backed race cars. And the result is one of the rarest Tri-5 Chevys of all time. Now this particular car, even though it has a lot of rare components like that fuel injection system, the 6-lug hubs, a lot of good period correct stuff, this is listed as a frame-off reproduction. So even though it does have the 283 horse fuel injection, the split exhaust manifolds, the heavy-duty 3-speed transmission, 20-gallon fuel tank, reinforced frame, dual shocks on all 4 corners, sway bar, and heavy-duty radiator, this is not one of the very, very few actual Black Widow cars that were produced in 1957. Now you might be noticing a pattern here. 55 Chevrolets make the ultimate hot rod, and that's a lot of what I'm covering in this video. Even though there were plenty of 56s and 7s, the 55s stand out because there's so many options here. Even though this one's got some ratty paint on it, it's got a really cool stance. It's down low, it's not sitting way up in the air. It's got skinny Kragers on the front, it's got pie crust slicks on the back, sticking out ever so slightly out of those radius quarter panels. It's got a super tall tunnel ram with 2 4s and those cool scoops. It's got a lot of stuff going for it. Now sitting next to it is an extremely clean car. This is what I would consider show car level quality. Again, 55 Chevy, but you'll see under the one-piece tilting front end, this has a very special engine. This is one of only 427 engines that Chevrolet produced that replicated the ZL1. This is a 427 cubic inch combination. It's got an aluminum block, aluminum cylinder heads, and this particular one has a GM tri-power setup off of a late 60s Corvette. I love the orange paint. I love the Nomad quarter panels instead of just a rough cut around the radius. This thing's got a killer stance. It's not way up in the air, but it just has that aggressive, ready to go stance that a lot of those drag cars had in the 60s. And we'll take a look inside and you'll see that there's nothing real special or crazy in here. It's got a Hurst shifter sticking up out of the floor. It's got 60s style buckets, black and white interior, just a few gauges hanging underneath, and a tack up on the dash. This is a great combination that proves that gassers don't have to be rough around the edges. They can have show car quality details and still have that really awesome attitude that we all know and love. So if you've watched any of my videos, you know that I love to go through the swap meet at any event. And the Tri-5 Nationals, you know, there's a lot of Tri-5 specific parts. And since I don't own a Tri-5, a lot of those parts don't interest me. But I do always get a kick out of some of the project cars that are for sale. So the first car I noticed when I pulled up was this 57 Chevy sedan delivery. This car has a straight axle under the front. It's got no front bumper. It's got some old flames, some old lettering on the side. It's got a lot of great old details, and I'm not sure of the history on this thing. I just really liked some of the personality here, that hand lettering in the delivery panel area, and just the idea that this thing is still hanging together. Even though it's got some primer spots, it's got some age on it, it's still a really cool piece. And they were looking to get $28,500 out of it. Another potential project car is this 56 Chevrolet. Now this one is an old school gasser. You can see the fender wells have been cut out in the back. It's got a straight axle under the front. It's got an old 3-point style roll bar in it and lots of old parts. You can see it's got a moon tank on the front. It's got a hole cut out in that fiberglass front end for some kind of scoop or injection stacks to stick up out of. You could make a pretty serious car out of this thing with just a little bit of work. Some of my best swap meet finds have happened outside of the swap meet, and that's exactly what we're looking at here. We've got a couple of really rare fuel injection setups. This one is a Scott, and it uses a factory GM intake manifold that was used for Corvette fuel injection. So this piece is really rare because the injection parts bolt on to a factory intake manifold. And sitting next to it is a Kinsler piece with a similar background. This is a specially cast intake manifold that has both GM part numbers and the Kinsler name cast into it. And you'll see that it's got a little bit bigger butterflies, a little bit more elaborate throttle linkage setup. This is a much more serious combination, but both pieces were extremely cool. All right, check this thing out. Now, this event is exclusive to 55, 56, and 57 Chevrolets. And this car has a little bit more of like a Cadillac look to it, but that's because it's a very special car called the El Morocco. Ruben Allender from the Detroit area was a Cadillac guy, and he wanted to combine the affordability of a Chevrolet with the style and comfort of a Cadillac. So he actually created the El Morocco, and he built 16 of these cars in 1956 and 18 of them in 1957, and only a handful of them still exist. This one has been beautifully restored with its 283 engine, and it is an absolutely great piece of automotive history. I really like the diamond tucked interior with buttons, the slotted mags, the bi-sply tires on this 56 Bel Air, and under the hood it's even more special because it's got a big block Chevrolet, it's got an Offenhauser cross ram intake manifold, 2 4-barrel carburetors with velocity stacks, Mickey Thompson valve covers. It's got all the right parts in a really great 70s style build. I always love to see old lettering like this, and Copperhead Road, obviously that was the famous song from back in the day, but look at this 55 two-door post. No bumpers on it. It does have 210 trim on it, but you can see the tinted windows, the copper colored paint. This thing has got some age on it, and it's got some great personality. And underneath you'll see that they got the extra ride height on the front by modifying a set of spindles. You can see they've cut and welded on these spindles, which some people would say is a bad idea, but a lot of people got away with it for a lot of years. This was always an alternative to having a straight axle and leaf springs and having to completely redo the front suspension. Here's another 55 Chevrolet. This one has a pretty special engine combination, as it is another one of these ZL1 all aluminum 427 crate engines. So out of the 427 that were built, 2 of them were represented here at the Tri-5 Nationals. And this one's in a really slick black 2-door post sedan. You can see under the hood here, this thing is clean and simple, not a lot of drama, not a lot of crazy exotic parts, just an all aluminum 427 big block Chevrolet. And you'll see on the inside it's got a Delray interior. You can see that Hurst shifter sticking up out of the floor. And this thing's got a really slick black paint job. You can see the 210 trim, no front bumper, Krager wheels. It's got all the right stuff. Now, I'm always fascinated by a W motor inside of a Tri-5 Chevy. It's just one of those things that I love to see. And typically at the Tri-5 Nationals, there's maybe one or two. But this year, there were several cars that had 409s or possibly 348 engines. And we're going to take a look at some of them here. But it all started when I checked into my hotel and my room number was 409. I knew that was a good sign that this was going to be a great Tri-5 Nationals. So let's get started on these 409 and 348 Tri-5s. We're starting out with a 55 Chevrolet, of course. You notice a pattern here. Lots of 55s with hot rod engines, and this one is a great example. This is a 150 sedan, so it has no chrome on it, two-door sedan. It's got Nomad quarters, it's got Krager wheels, it's got pie crust slicks on the back. You look inside, it's got some 60s style buckets. It's got all the right stuff in here. You'll notice it does have some cup holders and a console. That's great for driving, not quite period correct, but I'll let them pass on that. But you'll notice it's got B gas markings on the quarter windows, which is proper for a 409 in a 55 Chevrolet. That's where it would have landed more than likely. But let's look under the hood on this one. This is a 409. It's got aluminum heads, two 4-barrel carburetors. It's got headers on it. It's got an aluminum water pump. This is a killer setup that looks right at home under the hood of this thing. You can see it's got an aluminum radiator. They've put power brakes on this car. This thing is definitely a rowdy combination that's ready for the road. Here's another 409, this time a little more modest as far as the engine setup. It doesn't have aluminum heads, but it does have some cool finned aluminum valve covers, two 4s, and it's under the hood of a bright yellow 55 two-door post Bel Air. Now this one's a little bit different. It appears to be a 348, and I'm just saying that based on the tri-power setup here up top, but it could very well be a 409 with tri-power, but it is under the hood of a 56 Chevrolet, and this thing kind of has like a late model or contemporary pro touring look, which is totally out of the ordinary because normally you see this with a vintage style car. The other 409 cars on display were actually in the show field, and they were very nicely detailed show cars, and they ended up, both of them made it into the top 25, which was very impressive because the group of cars in the top 25 was out of this world. And these two 409 cars, both of them have some modern details, but they got a killer 409 under the hood, including one of them having a Lamar Walden 409, which is extra special and extra horsepower compared to the others, but great combinations all the way around. So that's it for my coverage from the Tri-5 Nationals presented by CPP. This event has tons of great action, and I'm sorry that I didn't provide you with any video footage of the drag racing action. I was busy taking pictures for the American Tri-5 magazine. So if you want to watch drag racing action from the Tri-5 Nationals, be sure to go to Throttle Power. He's got tons of footage from the drag strip. You're going to see a lot of great wheels up action, big smoky burnouts, lots of great side-by-side quarter-mile drag racing. So tune in to Throttle Power and stay tuned for more videos with in-depth features on some of these Tri-5s I showed you here today.